Hello, everyone, and welcome to a WEDI Special Spotlight Intermediaries in Practice Real World Fire Testing and Transactional Roles. This is presented by Drummond Group and KONZA Health. It's my pleasure to introduce from Drummond, Tim Bennett.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate the opportunity today. I'm excited to uh, share with you guys some things, our recent developments here at Drummond, particularly our partnership with KONZA Health. And to that end, I'm going to sort of um, introduce Jody Denson, or I'll have her introduce herself, um, who's going to be co-presenting with me today. So, Jody, go ahead, introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Hi, I'm Jody Denson. I am the Chief Technology Officer at KONZA Health, and happy to be here today and partner with the Drummond Group to do this presentation.
Yeah, and I'm Timothy Bennett. I'm the Director of Strategic Healthcare Initiatives at Drummond, and mainly for the last couple of years, been really thinking long and hard about how do we test fire at scale, how do we test fire in the real world, how do we move beyond the connectathon and the pilot, and part of that thinking has been we have to have intermediaries to be a central part of that scalable real world testing strategy. And so excited to sort of explore, how that has taken shape. Jody's going to kind of start off for the first, part of the presentation today, just kind of talk about um, intermediaries, their role in this brave new world. And then I'll come in and I'll kind of talk about how Drummond, with our real world interoperability testing program, FHIRplace, has been thinking about how do we sort of meet some of those challenges of intermediary fire exchange. And then we'll just kind of wrap up at the end, just kind of talk about how have been sort of working together, collaborating, and what the future sort of feels like it's going to what the future is sort of going to look like as we bring on more intermediaries into the picture as well. All right, so without further ado, Jody, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Timothy. So we will talk here for a little bit around, as Timothy said, what is the role of the intermediary? What do we do? And I think that this can take several different forms depending on the use case and the partners. But in general, I'll kind of talk about the generalities here. So an intermediary, I think as the name applies, is an entity that sits between payers and providers for the purpose of data exchange. So that means whether you're getting a request for data from a provider and you're sending it to a payer, or if you're getting a request from a provider for claims data from a payer, and that intermediary is kind of sitting in the middle and managing those relationships and that exchange of data. So they manage these, the idea is that they manage these transactions that neither endpoint handles directly. So it kind of solves some technical problems and possibly some capability problems. And then the intermediary owns the data routing. So when that query comes in, it's up to the intermediary to decide and to understand who that data is coming from, what they need, and where they need to route that request to. And then when they bring the data back, that intermediary needs to know, okay, that data was requested in FHIR, for example, but I got the data in XML. And so the intermediary transforms that data from XML to FHIR and then delivers that data per the request. The other piece that the intermediary does is they comply with regulatory and compliance obligations. And even even technical compliance. So the intermediary manages those components, whether it's adhering to FHIR R4, US CDI, US Core, and then security compliance around OAuth and Smart on Fire, or HIPAA compliance for regulatory compliance. And I think the other piece that they manage is really the ecosystem compatibility. So different EMR vendors handle transactions in different ways. And so that intermediary really sits in the middle and helps on those relationships and those requirements. And then I think a great component of an intermediary is that record locator service. So that involves a master patient index. With that RLS, an intermediary can know, once they get the request for information, which entity they need to go to retrieve that information. Or maybe there's multiple entities that they need to go to retrieve that information. And so with that RLS tied to that intermediary, that kind of takes the workload off of others. It's up to the intermediary to figure all of that out. And then they maintain the network CRM data, so NPIs and address and contact information, and manage all those components. And then the security. So are we going to connect using MTLS? Are we going to use Smart on Fire? Those different things are all managed by the intermediary, but definitely in partnership with the payers and the providers. And then I think a good intermediary, as KONZA does, provides help desk support, provides training as needed, is kind of the point of contact for any technical troubleshooting, and then the intermediary can farm those issues out. So next slide, please. Okay, so on this, we thought it might be a good idea to give you all a real life example of how KONZA acts as an intermediary. And I think that this is a really good use case that KONZA's been involved in this for, I think, going on over a year now, helping to solve a problem as an intermediary. So we've been doing this work with Missouri Department of Mental Health. They have the state stood up a FHIR server, and they have taken these care plans and converted the data into FHIR and put this information into their FHIR server. And so, kind of the problem to solve is. Right, Missouri wants to share this data with providers that have a treatment relationship with these patients that have a PCSP care plan. So how do we do that, right? Because this is a FHIR server, there's a FHIR endpoint, it's FHIR enabled. And part of what KONZA did in partnership with Missouri and other HINs is once the state, right, had built this infrastructure, providers didn't have a way to access the care plans. Or they did, but it was complicated and overly burdensome for them. And so what we built out was that these providers could send a query request to KONZA. KONZA would have a patient panel that was shared with us by the state of Missouri. When the query would come in from a provider, we would check to see if the patient that they're looking up data on is on this patient panel. And if they are, then KONZA sends a FHIR query to Missouri's FHIR endpoint, retrieves that care plan in a FHIR bundle, and sends it back to the provider. But there's a couple of problems with that. So that care plan has an IG associated to it. And so some of the EMRs weren't able to ingest that care plan into their EMR. They just hadn't configured it to that IG. And so what we did a couple of different things there. We took that FHIR bundle and we converted it into a CCD, an XML document. So number one, a provider could then pull that back in an XML and incorporate that into their EMR. And then in addition to that, we made that available in our provider portal. So our provider could log into the KONZA hosted provider portal, query for a patient, hit the Missouri endpoint, and retrieve that care plan that then displays in a human readable form in the KONZA provider portal. So I think the great thing about this project is this is critical information that Missouri is gathering, that providers want access to, but there was some interoperability stumbling blocks there. And so I think in partnership with Missouri and the other HINs in the state, we really helped, I think, solve a problem to provide more data at the point of care. Okay, next slide, Timothy, please. So what are the challenges of being an intermediary in a FHIR world? There are quite a few. This list could have gone on and on, but I wanted to hit the highlights. So that workflow orchestration, right, which is also, I think, tied into the timing expectations. How quickly does the provider need information back? How quickly does the payer need information back? And what type of data might a provider or a payer be requesting? If they want, let's say, for prior authorization, they might need to know several things about a patient. Have they received physical therapy, and have they had lab tests done? So that orchestration of workflow of what data they need, where are we going to go to get the data? How are we going to gather it all together and then return it back in for one request? And then I think implementation standardization. So we have V2 data, right? We have V3 data, we have claims data. And I think FHIR helps to streamline some of that standardization in transacting data back and forth. The other thing that is a challenge for intermediaries is missing required fields in the data and local mapping. So we see this issue a lot with LOINC mapping, local codes. So the intermediary can sit in the middle and make sure that those fields are populated or that have a mapping tool in place to kind of standardize that. And then I think I touched on a little bit, regulatory and compliance requirement diversity. So different states would have different regulatory and compliance requirements. You always want to look at, HIPAA and CMS and TAFCA obligations. And so that intermediary, I think, is that point entity that makes sure that those requirements are considered and adhered to. Next slide, please. So what the intermediary role demands in the ecosystem. I think that there are just increasing challenges across the systems. The challenges, I think, grow, and each system has different, different requirements, different issues, different ways of communicating. And so that intermediary can really identify those, whether it's technical discovery, security discovery, but really kind of do the work there at that level. And then the problems grow to be able to make the data ubiquitous. So I think that in kind of analyzing the data, and I mean, even if you think about data provenance, right? That's another thing that is a challenge across systems. We have to ensure that there's correct data provenance with that data when we're sending it back and forth. And then organizations require automation to scale solutions. So what are those different requirements of the payer? What are the different requirements of the provider? Even when you talk about prior auth and filling out the correct forms and gathering the correct information, and that can be really labor intensive. And so to be able to automate that, I think is what is an appropriate request of the intermediary. And that is something that KONZA works towards providing as a benefit. So Tim, I'm not sure if there's one more slide or if we're at the end there. Oh, the unknowns. So what do we still not know? This list could have been a longer list too, but I thought I would try to summarize. Um, so standards in active practice across the clinical ecosystem. I think where that comes in is really understanding um, each practice that we're working with or each provider that we're working with and really what standards that they're adhering to. They can differ. They can differ by practice. They can differ by practice that has different EMRs. So those are kind of some nuances. And then adoption and active practice of these standards across the system. I think seeing that adoption happen. So, I think some of the issues that we can run into is even if we know some of these practices, their EMRs are certified with FHIR endpoints, having that actively adopted by that provider and having that endpoint stood up and ready to accept queries or to send data is, I think, not quite, it's growing to be standardized across the system. And then specialty specific standards, you can see there, imaging standards is kind of much different than what the prescription data standards would be. And so those are things that we still need to dive into and document and make sure that we're compliant when we are involved in this process of sending data back and forth. Okay. So I think the three categories that must be resolved. So we've got technical, regulatory, and partner readiness. So I think how partners implement FHIR IGs varies. Some have systems set up where it's much more streamlined and easy to implement a FHIR IG, whereas others it's very manual. Lots of coding is involved in order to implement and adhere to those standards. And then real behaviors can differ from stated capabilities. If you hit a FHIR endpoint and you want to retrieve resources, I think that endpoint can be enabled and ready, but they may only be able to return certain resources because kind of that's what they're coded to do. So there's some technical issues I think there that need to be investigated. And then error patterns only visible at scale that you can really see. And that I think that requires some data quality analysis to identify where, if and when those errors are happening. And then regulatory, which obligations apply to the intermediary role, I think is important to be really clearly defined and shared with all partners when this work happens. And then where CMS and ONC rules land for non-endpoint actors. I think that is a really complicated statement. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that all partners really understand where those obligations lie. And then audit requirements that apply across both sides. So we want to be able to meet audit requirements and requests from both sides, and they may differ. Payers' audit requirements from providers, and how I think even how quickly we can produce an audit. What's that turnaround time? And then partner readiness. Like I said, some partners may be more ready than others. There may need to be that conversion. Some partners may not be able to accept FHIR data, and that will have to be converted into probably XML. Or they may not be able to send a FHIR query, but they can send an API, just a regular API, and then that can be changed into a FHIR query. So where are the partners at in terms of capabilities? And then how to test without disrupting production. Having those test environments ready, making sure there's no PHI in those test environments, I think is a important component that we can use here with Drummond. Okay, so looking ahead, the EPA testing an intermediary role as a marketplace influencer. So I think that, partnerships with any organization, working with data as a repository. So I think that repository is really key because that means that that repository will most likely have data from multiple entities. So that patient may receive care in a variety of different places. And if you have a repository with all of that data, I think that that saves time. It ensures kind of good interoperability, and that data is collected in one spot, and then sent to that partner organization to help with that EPA workflow. And then it fulfills the marketplace need and gap to these interoperability workflows. So again, having that data, having really that record locator system, I think is really a big benefit to ensuring interoperability. And then querying across intermediary infrastructures for a fast turnaround time. So that goes back to the workflows. It goes back to that intermediary being able to have the infrastructure, I think, in place to respond quickly and to return data in a timely manner is really important. Okay, and I do see a question. So I'll get through this slide and then we'll come back to that question. Maybe it was a comment. So what intermediaries manage that endpoints don't? A consistency across dozens of simultaneous partner connections. So it's kind of standardized the way that we're connecting, standardized with really at least basic security requirements, and the technical components, standardized onboarding documentation, and this can apply to multiple partners who all connect in. So that, for instance, a provider doesn't have to connect to 5, 6, 7, 8 different payers, and a payer doesn't have to connect to multiple providers. And then version and capability mismatches between trading partners. So we're kind of back to, whether it's FHIR-R4 or US CDI, or only being able to respond with V2 data or V3 data, and then error handling when neither endpoint owns the failure. I think that intermediary can really, whether it's through audit logs, transaction logs, can kind of write point on how to address error issues. And then enforcing security requirements, right? So you have two different entities connecting in, and they can't connect in unless these basic security requirements are met, and making sure that the provider and the payer, the different entities understand and agree to these different security requirements. And I think that all of these things help help to manage the trust frameworks. And then auditing and logging obligations spanning both sides. Again, being able to produce audit reports kind of on demand, being able to produce whether it's monthly audit reports to both sides, and handling that relationship and that technical development work, I think is a good role for an intermediary. Okay, Timothy.
Jody, do you want to address Yvette's question in the chat? Where does
Sure.
this intermediary fit in the overall E2E flow?
Sure. So I don't, Tim, were you going to, I don't know if you had this on part of your slide to address, but I think, where it would sit. So it's really, it's kind of that entity that really manages, I think, the relationship back and forth. And I think that in terms of in terms of the flow, that is something that we're working towards and we're trying to define better. I think it's a great question. I think we would welcome any and all feedback, and suggestions on. I think where the issue is how much does the intermediary need to get involved in that flow? How much do the partner organizations want the intermediary to get involved in that flow? I think that there's opportunities to explore that and really develop that out.
And by E to E flow, I'm guessing that's end to end. Is that what is that? Is that what we mean by that? I guess maybe just clarify that for me at least in the chat. Is that?
Let's see. Who are you hoping will provide
Yes,
it?
yeah, okay.
Okay, yes, end inflow.
Yeah.
Okay, and then next question, who are you hoping will provide the test data to perform testing? So that's a good question too. I think we could go two ways. So I think that the intermediary or Drummond
Yeah.
could have standard test data that is shared among all participants. I think there's even an opportunity if for the intermediary to supply that information, but that would be um, um, we'll have to make sure that whoever queries has that information and whatever entity is getting queried has that test data to be able to retrieve. So I think I don't think that there's a standard way to do that. I think it would be nice to have multiple ways to exchange and provide test data.
Yeah, I am going to kind of talk a little bit about test data when we talk about end-to-end interoperability testing, so I can address some of that too.
Okay, great. And then I see another question in here about, is the trust established between the state and KONZA? And then KONZA and the provider, or does the state need to know the provider you are serving? So I'm kind of assuming that you're talking about that example that I gave you. So it's established, it's a good question. It's established among all of them, right? And this kind of goes to the intermediary role. So KONZA did establish a trust relationship with the state through regulatory compliance, security compliance, testing, multiple meetings, all of that. And then typically the provider is a provider that's linked into KONZA. So KONZA has an established relationship with that provider and has some sort of technical connection to them. And so again, you can kind of see KONZA sits in the middle there and kind of manages that interaction back and forth. And does the state need to know the provider you are serving? The state doesn't need to know the provider we're serving as long as there is a treatment relationship with that provider and that patient. Although we do keep that information like in an audit log. So if the state ever wanted to run an audit of which providers have requested this data, we would make that available to them. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Good questions.
Yep. And there'll be more opportunities for you folks to ask questions as well, not only for Jody, but for me. So let's move on at this point to the next part of our presentation. And this is, really Drummond's thinking about how do we do real world scalable testing and the role of our FHIRplace program in this and why we think intermediaries need to be a central part of that. So what is FHIRplace? Let me just kind of talk about this a little bit. We wanted to help develop a interoperability focused testing ecosystem that doesn't sort of leave implementers, sort of on their own to do testing. We see that, especially as regulatory deadlines approach, folks are sort of having to, I won't say scramble, but figure out how they're going to test beyond just using test tools or reference implementations or maybe their favorite test partner or whatever, or customer or collaborator that they have, but be able to have access to many different test partners. And our thinking around this at Drummond was, if you're a payer, if you're a provider, technology developer, your business, you have to test. I mean, you can't not, roll out, these complex solutions without testing. But, that's not really the core of your business, is testing and finding test partners. And if there were, a sort of a broker available to help bring different implementations together to where that they could test with each other, and those test partners would be sort of at their fingertips. They wouldn't have to search hard or spend a lot of their own energy finding and coordinating testing. Then we think that would be a value to the marketplace. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do with FHIRplace, is build this value added community of folks who say, we want to test our FHIR applications and solutions at scale, and with as many different partners as possible, and do this in a consistent way, in a standardized way, so that every test that we do with someone else is not different, that there's some sort of consistency across the board. Test data was brought up a few moments ago, and that's the first question I think most people ask when we start talking about doing any kind of scalable testing, is what kind of test data we're going to use. And so Drummond's been thinking about this, talking with other folks about this for a while. And so part of FHIRplace is starting to build a test data repository that we can share across many health plans and provider facing applications, and begin to sort of emulate how patients interact with the healthcare system, with their payers and with their providers, and how their data flows in as close of a simulation or emulation of the real world as possible. The idea is that if we can have a scalable testing ecosystem close enough to the real world, then hopefully the only difference is that we're not using real patients. We're using some form of synthetic patients, but everything else that we test is as close to the real world as possible. And so, we're all sort of in this world where now we're beginning to develop and adopt FHIR technology, but some folks are at different, stages of their, deployments. And so being able to find the right kind of partners to match with the kind of FHIR capabilities that you possess today, but also understand that as your capabilities grow over time, you'll need to continue to test and retest. And when we start talking about payers and their, medical policies around prior authorization, or other business rules that they may have in place, those also change over time. And when we talk about interoperability testing, we're talking about not just testing the nerdy parts of FHIR, how does this data flow over the wire? What kind of data formats are we talking about? But also thinking about the content of that data. Jody brought up earlier the different LOINC codes, or the terminologies and the value sets. That's a core part of the data. And then of course the business rules that are in place that fire off and determine what the data and the responses are to begin with. That's not really, FHIR from an implementation guide doesn't really it talks about the format and maybe what kinds of data needs to be there, but it doesn't really talk about the business rules themselves. And that's a very important part of interoperability. And so being able to have a testing ecosystem and environment that addresses all of this complex multi-party complex choreographies of message exchange is important. And so that's the I guess the the main things here that we're trying to address with FHIRplace is that we're testing actual systems with each other, not reference implementations, not test tools, but actual, the products themselves, and that we are addressing and testing the real world kinds of scenarios and test cases that they will encounter, when they deploy, your products into the real world. We also believe that because of the complexity of this and the robustness and how we need to sort of scale the testing, you need someone who's sort of managing and coordinating the testing, so that testers and implementers are sort of not left on their own on an island to kind of figure it out and to, not just find their own test partners, but once we do, what do we do with that, and what do we do with the data and the results that we find? And so we know from our own experience at Drummond with doing interoperability testing in other domains that we're going to find interoperability issues, and we need to do something with those. We need to, first of all, help resolve them and find solutions to them, but also sort of triage them and say, okay, what was the root issue? What's the root cause of this interoperability? Can we improve the standards? Can we go back to the spec authors and say, this part needs to be better, or this part's not being implemented consistently? And is there a way that we can improve that or change it to adapt to the way that the industry really needs to exchange data this way? Or are we finding issues, and we will, that are outside the scope of those standards, especially like when we're talking about business rules and how they may be fired off in a consistent manner, and the content of the data being exchanged, things that fall outside the actual protocol standards and have more to do with how does this complex data exchange work in the real world with all of these different sort of players that are involved in touching the data and moving the data and responding to the content of the data. And what kind of emerges from that is that there needs to, the industry will need to have consensus on how to solve interoperability issues and say, this is how we make this technology work in a scalable manner in the real world, and then share that learned guidance across the marketplace, so that interoperability becomes a reality and not just some glimmer in our eyes at this point. And then the other thing is, this isn't just about meeting a deadline. Of course, that's very important. A regulatory deadline is vitally important, but I just want to continue to emphasize it. It starts there. It doesn't end there. That's not the destination. That's really the beginning of the journey. As once we start to roll these things out into production, things are going to change over time. Your policies are going to change. Your FHIR versions are going to change. Specs are going to change, and you're going to learn how to make them more efficient and reduce bottlenecks. And that means we have to continuously adopt this notion of we have to continuously test, and have a place where we can go and roll out our improvements and our changes to our system and test them ahead of time before we deploy them in a real world way. So I'll kind of move on here, but those are the kinds of things that we have the idea with FHIRplace, is that we sort of establish this way to test FHIR at scale, and sort of go beyond the initial ways that we've been testing FHIR, which are important. I mean, we have to do conformance testing. We have to do we have to go to connectathons and make sure this stuff works, but we have to then move beyond that and go, okay, are we realizing the real benefit of FHIR and electronic prior authorization, for instance, by being able to um, not only understand or know that it works, but that it's accurate and that it's efficient, so that we can fully realize the potential and the cost savings. So let me kind of talk about FHIRplace, and this is where I'm going to start to reconnect this with what Jody shared before, as an intermediary. And so thinking about testing FHIR at scale and building this sort of real world ecosystem, in which we focus on the folks that are in the trenches, the providers, the payers, their technology vendors that are enabling this technology to work, and then folks, intermediaries that's helping to make the connections possible and for the data to flow seamlessly and in an interoperable manner. But then also, how do we then also pull in this sort of third-party managed approach to brokering the testing and ensuring that the testing happens consistently, and that we are actually scaling in different dimensions of interoperability. And so this diagram sort of shows, somewhat in a simplified manner, a picture of this sort of testing ecosystem. The top part of this diagram is focused on the provider systems and the payer systems, and they're exchanging data through intermediaries. And you'll notice that there's no tools in there. This is how the data flows in the real world, and even in a testing ecosystem, we want that to occur that way. We don't want to inject tools that aren't going to be there in the real world in between the transactions. We don't want to introduce latency or other kinds of artificial interceptors or things like that to influence or change the way that the testing is done. We want to try to emulate the real world as much as possible, but we do need to influence the data that is flowing from a testing standpoint. And then so that's where sort of FHIRplace comes in, and that's the sort of bottom of this. And the thing that sort of makes this go is what we call a connector. We call it, we actually call it the FHIRplace Intermediary Connector. And the idea here is that we establish a connection between the intermediary and our FHIRplace server that sort of acts as a test orchestration and management tool, which I'll get to a little bit more in just a second. But the idea here is that the intermediary then, in a near real-time fashion, but not in a way that slows down their transactions, are able to stream to FHIRplace these raw FHIR transactions, or data. Doesn't even have to be FHIR necessarily, but that's what we're kind of focused on. But these transactions that are going back and forth between providers and payers, or between payers in the case of payer data exchange, for instance, to FHIRplace, and then we are able to take that raw data and then do many things with it. And FHIRplace has its own sort of database of test cases and test plans around these standards like EPA. We have our repository databases for the test data, and the idea here is that we use the test data, we use our defined test plans to then trigger tests that happen between providers and payers, or between payers in the case of payer data exchange, through automation, through test orchestration that's sort of based on knowing what the FHIR capabilities are of the participants, and understanding what the plan, the health plan business rules are, so that we can actually send test cases to on a plan-by-plan basis to be able to exercise your business rules and test them from a wide variety of different, EHRs, and then be able to get those transactions through the intermediary, and then be able to analyze them, validate, did the transactions happen in an interoperable way. We could even, once we have these data, we can even call out to third-party tools outside of FHIRplace, like Inferno, if you did want to do conformance testing on the fly in a interoperability test, or if you wanted to use another tool like Picky, which sort of does data quality analysis of the of the data to scorecard. Is this data good? Could it be better to improve the process? That sort of thing, or to run other kinds of analytics and validation to understand where the issues and the the problems are happening. So, the idea here is to create that kind of system. So, I'll just kind of talk really quickly about the connector. So the idea is that the intermediary connects the connector at near their sort of point of capture of these transactions, and then, as I said before, sort of streams it down to FHIRplace with the raw data and some metadata about that about each transaction, and do it in such a way that it really has zero impact on the routing. So it's going to operate asynchronously. It's never going to sort of interrupt live transactions as they happen. And so the kinds of things that we're getting the raw FHIR requests and responses with their HTTP headers and some other metadata about it: who sent it, who received it, and different kinds of IDs. How long did it take the round trip to happen? We can even support multi-hop here, because that's just another intermediary in the stream, and so these IDs might not be the ultimate sender or receiver of the transaction. It could be just the other intermediary upstream or downstream, but we can sort of track how the data flows even through multi-hops, and how long it takes for that to happen. So if you're an intermediary and you're interested, Drummond sort of has 3 different ways that you can implement a connector, either through an embedded SDK, or you can roll out this sidecar application in your network. That's both of those sort of encapsulate how the data flows, or we just have a technical spec and tell you how we want you to send the data to us. So I think I've kind of probably hit on some of these already before, why intermediary testing is different. I mean, there is going to be point-to-point testing, but really in the real world, when we start talking about connecting, thousands or hundreds of thousands of providers with, thousands of payer systems, we have to rely on intermediaries to do, that connection. And so they're going to be an important part of how we deploy and scale, FHIR in the real world. And so, we feel like when we do intermediary-based testing, that proves that this system is going to kind of work in the real world. Whereas point-to-point is more about just, can these two systems, sort of at a fundamental level, kind of communicate with each other. So I kind of hit on some of these already before, but when we start doing this real world testing, we really begin to understand how the real world deployment is different than sort of testing in a lab or testing in, a scaled down version. We begin to grapple with version changes with implementations. We begin to grapple with how long does it take, transactions to travel, and what happens when, they don't, or what happens when the data is not good. And so, being able to, I think at Drummond we sort of did this analysis, and I think we have a taxonomy of FHIR interoperability issues that we might, and there's like 10 different categories. And so I think we want to, over time, build our test cases and our test plan that really begins to suss out these different ways that we can have interoperability issues and be able to target those kinds of test cases to make those. We in a test world, we want to find the issues, because we don't want to find them in deployment. And so we want to be brutal in our testing to some degree. I know we all like to pass tests and say that we're all conformant and compliant, and that's definitely the goal to get to. But we have to do the hard work to get there, and the hard work is finding where the issues are and fixing them. And everyone has, right? Everyone has issues. It's not just, no one's perfect. So I'm going to bring back Jody, and let's maybe kind of look in the chat here, Jody, and see if there's some questions that you or me can sort of answer at this point.
Yeah, I think there might be a few questions for you, Timothy.
Okay. Let's see. I see Mike says, would Drummond provide sufficient synthetic data? Yeah. So these are good questions about the test data. And, Jody kind of even mentioned before that the idea of sort of building, a community of people that's testing is we begin to tackle how do we generate test data to begin with. Everyone kind of has their own ideas, and some folks are doing really, interesting things with test data. So I would just say right now, Drummond has just started generating some test data, but we know that this test data is not the best that it can be, and that by, growing, the participation in FHIRplace and, bringing in different voices and different, ideas about this, then we can, over time, build the kinds of test data that are going to be beneficial. For me, I want to eventually have test data that, interjects chaos into the test data, and actually, the test data not be pure and good, right? It should be dirty to some degree. And so, how do we bring different, ideas into that? Are there ways to bring, AI into that to sort of, fabricate different ways of doing test data? I will even say this. Once we get into this place where we are actually capturing a lot of different interoperability test results and being able to analyze where the issues are, that can be feedback mechanisms into not just the kinds of test cases that we run and focus on where the hard parts are or the failure points are, but also I think it can also improve our test data as well over time as well. Another question here is, what's the difference between Inferno, Touchstone, and Drummond test cases? I think here, our idea here is, FHIRplace testing is is kind of focused on interoperability. We want to test the workflows. We want to test the end-to-end. But we can't just turn a blind eye to conformance testing like what Inferno and Touchstone does. When we can't turn a blind eye to the actual IGs either, even though we're kind of focused on testing to see if these implementations work sort of in a real world environment. We also still have to, have some roots into the conformance of the standards and the specs that we're testing as well. And so tools like Inferno and Touchstone that are written around conformance, we do want to make sure that we align our test cases and our test scenarios for interoperability testing with, with conformance tools, either at an arm's length by just sort of looking at those test scripts and being able to formulate, end-to-end testing, that aligns with that, so that implementations that go through interoperability testing are also ready to do conformance testing and it gets certified by ONC or whatnot. But as I mentioned before, I mean, we could, because we have the data and these tools generally support being able to call their own test scripts. Inferno and Touchstone both have API interfaces where you can call their test kits or test scripts remotely through APIs. We could just call out to them. And as you are doing interoperability testing, you can also call out to these tools and confirm their conformance from an HL7 validation standpoint as well, or from a to do that. Another question about like versions. We want people to bring whatever versions you have. In the real world, folks are going to, and Jody, I think, sort of addressed this before too, as they're connecting, different providers and payers. No one is ever, the whole ecosystem in the real world is never going to be on the same exact version of a FHIR IG. There's going to be version differences. And by having a testing ecosystem that says, we'll test whatever version you have because we want to understand how version differences affect interoperability. And the only way to kind of know that and document that and provide guidance around that is to test that, itself. All right. So let me also address Alana. How do folks sign up to test with Drummond and KONZA or work collaboratively to set up the testing and scale? So, Jody, we're already sort of, so KONZA has joined FHIRplace as an intermediary participant. So anyone can join FHIRplace. If you're a provider system, a technology vendor, a payer, there's roles for you to join and join the testing matrix, the testing group, and intermediaries are part of that. And we're going to be onboarding more intermediaries than just KONZA. In fact, Omega, for instance, is already signed on as a Drummond intermediary, and we're beginning to work with them. And there's others in the queue as well. So the idea here is that we're going to be able to test through multiple different intermediaries. Eventually, we'll do multi-hop as we jump from intermediary to intermediary. But the way to join is to contact Drummond, and then we can begin to talk to you about how you can join FHIRplace. And I think we've also sort of worked with WEDI and their own efforts to raise the awareness of testing. I think WEDI has a website now where folks can go to that. They say that they're looking for test partners, and Drummond's going to be on that site too. So that'll be another way that you can find out the different kinds of testing events that we'll have around EPA ahead of the requirements of January 1. We are going to be doing a full CRD, DTR, PAS, end-to-end test event that's probably going to start in August, late August, or early September. It's going to roll through the end of the year. We'll have multiple intermediaries involved, and we'll be doing, a variety of different, test cases from, many payer systems and many EHRs that, that are onboarding now. So, hopefully that'll, that if that's something of interest for you to join, we would love to have you.
Thank you. Greatly appreciated, Tim and Jody, for a fantastic presentation. Folks, thank you very much for being a part of this WEDI Virtual Spotlight being brought to you by not only the Drummond Group, but KONZA. Have a great day.